The Duke of Montague had built his empire on control, controlling his emotions, his fortune, and every soul in his employ. But when he placed his beloved grandmother's care into the hands of a mysterious young woman with secrets in her eyes and gentleness in her touch, he discovered that the one thing he could never truly command was the treacherous territory of his own heart. The morning fog hung thick over Grosvenor Square as Duke Alfredo Montague stood at the tall windows of his London mansion, watching the city slowly awaken beneath a blanket of grey. At 34, he was a man who commanded respect through presence alone, tall and imposing, with dark hair that showed the first distinguished threads of silver at his temples, and steel-grey eyes that missed nothing. His jaw was strong and decisive, his bearing that of a man born to authority and wealth beyond most people's comprehension. Alfredo had inherited the Dukedom of Montague at the age of 25, along with vast estates, coal mines, shipping interests, and investments that spanned 3 continents. In the 9 years since, he had methodically expanded his holdings, turning an already impressive fortune into something approaching legendary status. Every decision was calculated, every risk carefully weighed, every aspect of his life organized with military precision. Control was not merely important to Alfredo, it was essential. It was the foundation upon which his entire existence rested, the principle that had guided him through the treacherous waters of high society, business dealings, and the constant parade of ambitious mothers seeking to marry their daughters to one of England's most eligible bachelors. Which was why the current situation troubled him so deeply. "Your Grace," came a soft voice from behind him, causing Alfredo to turn from his contemplation of the fog-shrouded square. Mrs. Pemberton, his housekeeper of 15 years, stood in the doorway with an expression that managed to convey both respect and barely contained worry. She was a woman of middle years, efficient and unflappable, who had never once failed to maintain the smooth operation of his household. The fact that she appeared distressed was itself cause for concern. "What is it, Mrs. Pemberton?" Alfredo asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "It's the Dowager Duchess, Your Grace," Mrs. Pemberton said carefully. "She's had another difficult night. Dr. Harrison was here until nearly dawn, and he's requested another word with you when convenient." Alfredo's jaw tightened imperceptibly. His grandmother, the formidable Dowager Duchess Eleanor Montague, had been the guiding force of his life since his parents' death in a carriage accident when he was 16. At 82, she remained sharp as a blade mentally, but her body was betraying her with increasing frequency. The episodes of weakness, the difficulty breathing, the nights when she couldn't rest, they were becoming more common and more severe. "Where is Dr. Harrison now?" Alfredo inquired. "In your study, Your Grace. He's been waiting for nearly an hour." Alfredo nodded curtly and strode from the morning room toward his private study, his mind already working through the implications of whatever news the physician might bring. Dr. Harrison was not a man given to dramatics or unnecessary alarm, which made his request for a private audience all the more ominous. He found the elderly doctor seated in one of the leather chairs facing Alfredo's massive mahogany desk, his medical bag at his feet, and his expression grave. Dr. Harrison had been the family physician for over 30 years, had delivered Alfredo himself, and was one of the few people in London who dared to speak plainly to the Duke of Montague. "Harrison," Alfredo said by way of greeting, settling himself behind his desk. "I trust you have news about my grandmother's condition." "I do, Your Grace, though I'm afraid it's not the news either of us would prefer to hear." Dr. Harrison leaned forward slightly, his weathered hands clasped before him. "The Dowager Duchess's heart is failing, not rapidly but steadily and irreversibly. She has perhaps 6 months, possibly less." The words hit Alfredo like a physical blow, though he allowed no emotion to show on his carefully controlled features. "What can be done?" "Very little, medically speaking," Dr. Harrison replied honestly. "We can make her comfortable, ensure she has proper rest, avoid unnecessary exertion. But the most important thing now is that she not be left alone. She needs constant care and companionship." "She has Mrs. Pemberton and the household staff," Alfredo said, though even as he spoke the words he recognized their inadequacy. "With respect, Your Grace, Mrs. Pemberton is an excellent housekeeper, but she's not trained in nursing care, and the household staff, capable as they are, cannot provide the kind of personal attention the Dowager Duchess requires. She needs someone dedicated solely to her care, someone with medical knowledge, infinite patience, and the ability to provide both physical assistance and emotional support." Alfredo's mind immediately went to the practical considerations. "You're suggesting I hire a nurse?" I'm suggesting you hire a companion, Dr. Harrison corrected. Someone who can serve as both nurse and friend. The Dowager Duchess is a proud woman, Your Grace. She won't accept being treated as an invalid, but she might accept someone who approaches her care with dignity and respect. Do you have someone in mind? Alfredo asked, though he was already mentally reviewing the agencies that provided such services to wealthy families. Dr. Harrison hesitated, which was unusual for a man who typically spoke with complete confidence. As it happens, I do know of someone who might be suitable, a young woman of excellent character and considerable skill in caring for elderly patients. However, her circumstances are somewhat unusual. In what way? She's not from an agency, Your Grace. She's been caring for her own elderly relative for the past several years, but that lady recently passed away. The young woman finds herself in need of employment, but she lacks formal references or connections to the usual channels. Alfredo frowned. He was accustomed to dealing with established agencies, vetted servants with impeccable credentials, and lengthy histories of service to respectable families. The idea of hiring someone without proper references went against every instinct he possessed. What makes you believe she would be suitable? He asked. I attended her great-aunt during the final months of her illness, Dr. Harrison explained. The care this young woman provided was extraordinary, not just medically competent but genuinely compassionate. She anticipated needs before they arose, managed complex medications with precision, and most importantly, she treated her patient with unfailing dignity and kindness. I've rarely seen such dedication. And her background, her family. Respectable but modest circumstances, Dr. Harrison said carefully. Her great-aunt was a gentlewoman of limited means who took in her orphaned great-niece and provided her with an excellent education. The young woman is well-spoken, intelligent, and possesses the kind of natural refinement that would allow her to interact appropriately with the Dowager Duchess. Alfredo considered this information, weighing the risks against the urgent need for his grandmother's care. On one hand, hiring someone without proper references was exactly the sort of impulsive decision he had spent his entire adult life avoiding. On the other hand, Dr. Harrison's recommendation carried considerable weight, and the physician had never steered him wrong in matters concerning his family's health. What is this young woman's name? He asked finally. Miss Jacqueline Whitmore, Dr. Harrison replied. She's 26 years old, unmarried, and currently residing in modest lodgings in Bloomsbury while she seeks employment. 26 and unmarried, Alfredo repeated thoughtfully. Why has she never married? I believe she dedicated herself entirely to her great-aunt's care, Dr. Harrison said. The lady was ill for nearly 8 years, requiring constant attention. Miss Whitmore sacrificed her own prospects to ensure her relative received proper care. This information gave Alfredo pause. A woman who would dedicate 8 years of her life to caring for an elderly relative demonstrated exactly the kind of character and commitment his grandmother would need. But it also suggested someone with limited experience of the world, someone who might be overwhelmed by the demands of life in a ducal household. I would need to interview her personally, Alfredo said finally. If she's to be responsible for my grandmother's care, I must be certain of her suitability. Of course, Your Grace. Shall I arrange for her to call upon you? This afternoon, if possible, Alfredo replied. Time is of the essence. After Dr. Harrison departed, Alfredo remained in his study, contemplating the decision he was about to make. Hiring a companion for his grandmother was not merely a practical matter. It was an act of trust that went against every careful instinct he had cultivated over the years. He would be placing the most precious person in his life into the hands of a complete stranger, someone with no connections to vouch for her character beyond the word of his physician. Yet what choice did he have? His grandmother's health was declining rapidly, and she deserved to spend her remaining months in comfort and dignity. If Miss Jacqueline Whitmore possessed even half the qualities Dr. Harrison attributed to her, she might be exactly what the Dowager Duchess needed. At precisely 3 o'clock that afternoon, Mrs. Pemberton announced the arrival of Miss Whitmore. Alfredo had chosen to conduct the interview in his study rather than one of the more formal reception rooms, wanting to observe the young woman in a setting where she might feel less intimidated and more likely to reveal her true character. Miss Whitmore, Your Grace, Mrs. Pemberton announced, stepping aside to allow the visitor to enter. Alfredo rose from behind his desk, prepared to assess the young woman's suitability with the same methodical approach he brought to all his business dealings. What he was not prepared for was the immediate and entirely unexpected impact of her presence. Miss Jacqueline Whitmore was not a conventional beauty in the manner prized by society. She was of medium height, with a slender but graceful figure, dressed in a simple grey dress that spoke of modest circumstances, but impeccable taste. Her hair was a rich chestnut brown, arranged in a neat but unfashionable style that suggested practicality over vanity. But it was her eyes that captured Alfredo's attention. Large, expressive eyes of the deepest blue he had ever seen, eyes that seemed to hold depths of intelligence, compassion, and something else he couldn't quite identify. "Your Grace," she said, offering a perfect curtsy that managed to be both respectful and dignified. Her voice was soft but clear, with the refined accent of an educated woman. "Miss Whitmore," Alfredo replied, gesturing toward the chair facing his desk. "Please, be seated." As she settled herself in the chair, Alfredo found himself studying her with more attention than he typically devoted to potential employees. There was something about her bearing that intrigued him, a quiet confidence that seemed at odds with her modest circumstances, a composure that suggested she was accustomed to handling difficult situations with grace. "Dr. Harrison has spoken very highly of your qualifications," Alfredo began, falling back on the formal structure he had planned for the interview. "He tells me you cared for your great-aunt for several years." 8 years, Your Grace," Jacqueline replied, her hands folded calmly in her lap. "My great-aunt suffered from a progressive illness that required increasingly intensive care. I was privileged to be able to provide that care until her peaceful passing 3 weeks ago. And you have no formal training in nursing?" "No formal certification, Your Grace, but considerable practical experience. I learned to manage complex medications, recognize symptoms of distress, provide physical therapy, and adapt living arrangements to accommodate changing needs. Dr. Harrison was kind enough to guide me in the more technical aspects of care." Alfredo nodded, making mental notes of her responses. "Tell me about your background, Miss Whitmore, your family, your education." A shadow of sadness crossed Jacqueline's expressive features, though her composure remained intact. "I was orphaned at the age of 18, Your Grace. My parents died in an influenza outbreak, and I had no siblings or close relatives except for my great-aunt, Miss Margaret Whitmore. She took me in despite her own limited means and ensured I received an excellent education. When she became ill, caring for her was both my duty and my privilege." "What did your education encompass?" "Literature, history, mathematics, French, and music," Jacqueline replied. "My great-aunt believed that a woman should be prepared to support herself through her own accomplishments if circumstances required it. She proved to be quite prescient in that regard." There was no bitterness in her tone, despite the obvious hardships she had endured, only a quiet acceptance that impressed Alfredo despite himself. "And now you find yourself in need of employment." "Yes, Your Grace. My great-aunt's estate was modest, and her medical expenses over the years were considerable. I have enough funds to maintain myself for perhaps 2 months while I seek suitable employment." Alfredo appreciated her honesty about her financial situation. Many people in similar circumstances would have attempted to conceal their desperation, but Miss Whitmore stated the facts simply and without embarrassment. "Dr. Harrison has explained the nature of the position I'm seeking to fill," Alfredo said. "My grandmother, the Dowager Duchess, is in declining health and requires constant care and companionship. The role would be demanding, requiring both medical knowledge and considerable patience. I understand, Your Grace. Dr. Harrison mentioned that the Dowager Duchess is a lady of strong character who values her independence." "That's putting it diplomatically," Alfredo said with the ghost of a smile. "My grandmother is formidable, opinionated, and does not suffer fools gladly. She has little patience for weakness or sentimentality, and she will not tolerate being treated as an invalid." "I would never presume to treat any patient as anything less than a complete person deserving of dignity and respect," Jacqueline said firmly. "Illness may limit what someone can do, but it doesn't diminish who they are." The conviction in her voice struck Alfredo as entirely genuine, and he found himself beginning to understand why Dr. Harrison had recommended her so highly. "The position would require you to live in this house, to be available at all hours should my grandmother need assistance. You would have your own quarters, of course, but your time would not be entirely your own." "I understand, Your Grace. For the past 8 years, I've been available to my great-aunt whenever she needed me. I'm accustomed to adapting my schedule to accommodate someone else's needs." "And you would be comfortable living in a ducal household? The formality, the protocols, the constant presence of other staff." For the first time since entering the room, Jacqueline hesitated slightly. "I'll admit I have no experience with such grand establishments, Your Grace, but I'm a quick learner, and I believe that treating everyone with courtesy and respect is the foundation of proper behavior in any setting. Alfredo found himself impressed by her honesty about her inexperience, as well as her practical approach to overcoming it. "The salary would be generous," he said, naming a figure that caused Jacqueline's eyes to widen slightly, though she quickly composed herself. "That's very generous indeed, Your Grace." "The care of my grandmother is worth any expense," Alfredo said simply. "She is the most important person in my life, and I want to ensure she receives the best possible care during this difficult time." Something in his tone seemed to resonate with Jacqueline, and her expression softened with understanding. "I can see how much you care for her, Your Grace. That speaks very well of your character, and it would be an honor to help care for someone so clearly beloved." The sincerity in her voice caught Alfredo off guard, and he felt something shift in his chest, a warmth he hadn't expected and couldn't quite explain. "When would you be able to begin?" "Immediately, if you wish, Your Grace. I have no other commitments, and if the Dowager Duchess is in need of care, I see no reason to delay." Alfredo studied her face for a long moment, searching for any sign of deception or hidden agenda. What he saw was exactly what Dr. Harrison had described: intelligence, compassion, and an unshakable integrity that seemed to radiate from her very being. "Very well, Miss Whitmore," he said finally. "I'm prepared to offer you the position. Mrs. Pemberton will show you to your quarters and explain the household routines. You may begin your duties tomorrow morning." Relief and gratitude flooded Jacqueline's features, though she maintained her composure. "Thank you, Your Grace. I won't disappoint you." "See that you don't," Alfredo replied, though his tone was gentler than his words might suggest. "My grandmother's welfare is not a matter I take lightly. Nor would I, Your Grace. You have my word." As Jacqueline rose to leave, Alfredo found himself watching her with an attention that surprised him. There was something about her, a quality of quiet strength and genuine warmth, that lingered in his mind long after Mrs. Pemberton had escorted her from the room. He told himself that his interest was purely practical, that he was simply pleased to have found a suitable companion for his grandmother. But as he returned to his correspondence, Alfredo found his thoughts drifting repeatedly to deep blue eyes and the soft conviction in a voice that had promised not to disappoint him. For a man accustomed to controlling every aspect of his life, the realization that he was already thinking about Miss Jacqueline Whitmore in terms that had nothing to do with his grandmother's care was deeply unsettling. But as the afternoon shadows lengthened across his study, Alfredo was forced to acknowledge that something had changed in the space of a single interview. The woman he had hired to care for his grandmother might prove to be far more dangerous to his carefully ordered existence than he had ever imagined. First impressions. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with autumn sunlight streaming through the tall windows of Montague House. Alfredo had risen early, as was his custom, and completed his morning correspondence before most of London had stirred from their beds. But despite his attempts to maintain his usual routine, he found himself listening for sounds from the upper floors where his grandmother's suite was located, wondering how Miss Whitmore's first day would unfold. The Dowager Duchess Eleanor Montague was not an easy woman under the best of circumstances. Brilliant, imperious, and possessed of standards that would challenge a saint, she had reduced more than one servant to tears with her sharp tongue and exacting expectations. Alfredo loved her dearly, but he was under no illusions about her character. If Miss Whitmore was to succeed in this position, she would need to prove herself worthy of his grandmother's respect, something that was neither easily earned nor lightly given. At precisely 9 o'clock, Mrs. Pemberton appeared in his study doorway with her morning report. "How is my grandmother this morning?" Alfredo asked before the housekeeper could speak. "Resting comfortably, Your Grace," Mrs. Pemberton replied, though her expression suggested there was more to the story. "Miss Whitmore has been with her since 7 o'clock." 7 o'clock, Alfredo repeated, surprised. He had expected the new companion to begin at a more conventional hour. "Yes, Your Grace. She arrived early and asked if she might introduce herself to the Dowager Duchess before the household became busy. She said she thought it would be less overwhelming for an elderly lady to meet a new person in quiet surroundings." Alfredo found himself impressed by this consideration, though he was curious about his grandmother's reaction to such an early introduction. "And how did the Dowager Duchess receive her?" Mrs. Pemberton's expression grew thoughtful. "Well, Your Grace, that's the interesting thing. I expected... Well, you know how Her Grace can be with new people, but when I checked on them an hour ago, they were having tea together and discussing the merits of various poets. The Dowager Duchess seemed quite engaged. This was unexpected news indeed. Eleanor Montague did not seem quite engaged with strangers, particularly not servants hired to care for her. She was far more likely to test their knowledge, challenge their opinions, and generally make their lives difficult until they proved themselves worthy of her attention. "They were discussing poetry?" Alfredo asked. "Yes, Your Grace. Something about Lord Byron's latest work, I believe. Miss Whitmore was holding her own quite admirably from what I could hear." Alfredo felt a stirring of curiosity that had nothing to do with his grandmother's welfare and everything to do with the woman who had apparently managed to engage the formidable Dowager Duchess in literary discussion before 9 o'clock in the morning. "I think I'll look in on them," he said, rising from his desk. "Mrs. Pemberton nodded approvingly. "I think that would be wise, Your Grace." The Dowager Duchess seemed quite pleased to have someone to talk with about books again. Alfredo made his way through the familiar corridors of his ancestral home, noting the subtle changes that Mrs. Pemberton had implemented over the years to accommodate his grandmother's declining mobility. Handrails had been discreetly installed along the walls, carpets secured to prevent slipping, and furniture arranged to provide support and easy navigation. It was a reminder of how much his grandmother's world had contracted, and how important it was that she have someone who could help her maintain her dignity within those constraints. As he approached his grandmother's suite, he could hear voices through the partially open door, his grandmother's familiar aristocratic tones, and a softer voice that he recognized as Miss Whitmore's. They were indeed discussing literature, and from what he could hear, Miss Whitmore was not merely agreeing with everything his grandmother said, but offering thoughtful counterpoints that seemed to delight the older woman. "I maintain that Byron's romanticism, while undeniably powerful, lacks the intellectual rigor of Pope's satirical work," his grandmother was saying with obvious enjoyment. "I understand your point, Your Grace," came Miss Whitmore's measured response. "But surely the emotional truth that Byron captures has its own kind of rigor. The discipline required to distill complex feelings into verse that resonates with readers across all social classes suggests a different but equally valid form of intellectual achievement." Alfredo paused outside the door, genuinely surprised by the sophistication of the discussion. Miss Whitmore was not simply humoring his grandmother, she was engaging with her as an intellectual equal, something that happened rarely in Eleanor's increasingly circumscribed world. "An interesting perspective," his grandmother conceded, and Alfredo could hear the approval in her voice. "You argue your point well, my dear. It's been too long since I've had a proper literary discussion." "I'm honored that you would share your thoughts with me, Your Grace," Miss Whitmore replied. "My great-aunt was also a lover of literature, and some of my happiest memories are of our conversations about books." "Tell me about this great-aunt of yours," Eleanor said, and Alfredo recognized the subtle interrogation that was beginning. His grandmother had a talent for extracting information from people without making it seem like an inquisition. "She was a remarkable woman, Your Grace. Miss Margaret Whitmore. She never married, choosing instead to dedicate herself to scholarship and charitable works. She corresponded with some of the leading intellectual figures of her time and maintained one of the finest private libraries I've ever seen." "And she raised you after your parents' death?" "She did, Your Grace. She said that education was the one thing that could never be taken away from a woman, and she was determined that I should be prepared for whatever life might bring." "Wise advice," Eleanor said approvingly. "Too many young women today are educated only in accomplishments designed to attract husbands. Your great-aunt understood that a woman needs resources of her own." "She did indeed, Your Grace. She often said that a woman should be able to support herself through her own abilities, not merely her connections or appearance." Alfredo found himself leaning closer to the door, fascinated by this glimpse into Miss Whitmore's background and character. The picture that was emerging was of a woman shaped by unusual circumstances and unconventional wisdom, someone who had been prepared for independence rather than dependence. "And now you find yourself putting that philosophy into practice," Eleanor observed. "Yes, Your Grace, though I'll admit that caring for you feels less like mere employment and more like a privilege. Dr. Harrison spoke so highly of your intelligence and character that I was quite nervous about meeting you." Eleanor's laugh was genuinely delighted. "Nervous? My dear girl, you've been holding your own in literary debate for the past hour. If you were nervous, you hide it remarkably well. Perhaps because you made me feel so welcome, Your Grace. It's clear that you're someone who values honest conversation over empty flattery." "Indeed I do," Eleanor said firmly. "I've had quite enough of people who tell me what they think I want to hear. It's refreshing to meet someone who speaks her mind." Alfredo chose that moment to knock gently on the doorframe and enter the sitting room. The scene that greeted him was one of comfortable companionship. His grandmother seated in her favorite chair by the window, looking more animated than he had seen her in months, and Miss Whitmore sitting nearby with a tea service between them and several books scattered on the small table at his grandmother's elbow. "Good morning, grandmother," he said, bending to kiss her cheek. "Miss Whitmore." "Alfredo, my dear boy," Eleanor said, her eyes bright with pleasure. "You've chosen excellently. Miss Whitmore and I have been having the most delightful conversation." "So I heard," Alfredo replied, glancing at Miss Whitmore, who had risen respectfully upon his entrance. "I hope you're finding everything satisfactory, Miss Whitmore." "Very much so, Your Grace," she replied. "The Dowager Duchess has been most kind in helping me understand her preferences and routines." "Preferences and routines," Eleanor snorted. "The girl makes it sound as though I'm some sort of exotic creature requiring special handling. We've been talking about books, Alfredo. When was the last time anyone in this house wanted to discuss literature with me?" Alfredo felt a pang of guilt at his grandmother's words. In his focus on business and the practical aspects of her care, he had perhaps neglected the intellectual stimulation that had always been so important to her. "I'm glad you're enjoying each other's company," he said sincerely. "More than enjoying," Eleanor said firmly. "Miss Whitmore has agreed to help me reorganize my library. Apparently, she has considerable experience in cataloging and maintaining book collections." Alfredo looked at Miss Whitmore with surprise. "You have experience with libraries?" "My great-aunt's collection, Your Grace," she explained. "She accumulated nearly 3,000 volumes over her lifetime, and maintaining proper organization was essential. I learned to catalog by author, subject and date of publication, as well as to assess condition and recommend preservation measures." 3,000 volumes, Alfredo repeated, impressed despite himself. "That's a considerable collection for a private library." "It was her passion, Your Grace. She believed that books were the foundation of civilization, and she treated each one as a treasure to be preserved for future generations." "A woman after my own heart," Eleanor declared. "Alfredo, you must see Miss Whitmore's system for organizing books. She's shown me some preliminary ideas that are quite brilliant." Alfredo found himself genuinely curious about Miss Whitmore's organizational methods, though he told himself it was purely practical interest. A well-organized library would certainly benefit his grandmother, and if Miss Whitmore possessed skills beyond basic companionship, it only increased her value as an employee. "I'd be interested to hear your ideas, Miss Whitmore," he said. "Well, Your Grace," she began, moving to the bookshelf that lined one wall of his grandmother's sitting room, "I noticed that the current arrangement is primarily alphabetical by author, which is certainly logical. But for someone who enjoys browsing and discovering connections between different works, a subject-based organization might be more stimulating." She gestured toward the shelves as she spoke, her enthusiasm for the topic evident in her animated expression. For instance, grouping all the romantic poetry together allows for easy comparison between different authors' approaches to similar themes, and placing historical works in chronological order can reveal how perspectives on events have evolved over time. Alfredo watched her explain her system, noting the way her face lit up when she discussed something she was passionate about. There was an intelligence and enthusiasm in her manner that was genuinely engaging, and he found himself listening not just to her words, but to the musical quality of her voice, the graceful gestures of her hands as she illustrated her points. "Show him the cross-referencing system you suggested," Eleanor urged. "Oh, that's probably too detailed to be of interest," Miss Whitmore said modestly. "On the contrary," Alfredo said, surprising himself with his eagerness to hear more. "I'm quite interested in efficient organizational systems." Miss Whitmore's cheeks flushed slightly at his attention, but she continued with growing confidence. "Well, I suggested creating a simple card catalog that would allow for multiple ways of finding books. Each book would have a card filed under author, another under subject, and a third under title. That way, if the Dowager Duchess remembers only part of a book's information, she could still locate it easily." "Brilliant," Eleanor declared. "Absolutely brilliant. Alfredo, this girl has a mind like a steel trap. You should see the way she's already memorized my medication schedule and anticipated my needs before I even realize I have them." Alfredo looked at Miss Whitmore with new respect. Organizational skills, intellectual curiosity, and the ability to anticipate needs. These were qualities that would serve his grandmother well, but they also suggested a level of competence that was rare in any field. "I'm impressed, Miss Whitmore," he said sincerely. "It seems Dr. Harrison understated your qualifications." "You're very kind, Your Grace," she replied, though he noticed she didn't deflect the compliment entirely. There was a quiet confidence about her that suggested she knew her own worth without being arrogant about it. "Kindness has nothing to do with it," Alfredo said. "I believe in recognizing competence when I see it." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Harrison, who had come for his regular morning check on the Dowager Duchess. Alfredo excused himself to allow the physician to conduct his examination, but not before noticing the easy way Miss Whitmore assisted with the medical routine, anticipating Dr. Harrison's needs, and helping his grandmother maintain her dignity throughout the process. As he returned to his study, Alfredo found his thoughts occupied not with the business correspondence awaiting his attention, but with the remarkable woman he had hired to care for his grandmother. Miss Jacqueline Whitmore was proving to be far more than he had expected, more intelligent, more capable, and more engaging than he had dared to hope. The realization that he was thinking about her in personal rather than professional terms was disturbing. Alfredo had built his life on careful control and rational decision-making. He did not allow emotions to cloud his judgment, particularly not emotions involving employees. But as he sat at his desk, ostensibly reviewing investment reports, his mind kept drifting to the sound of Miss Whitmore's laughter, the animation in her voice when she discussed books, and the gentle competence with which she had handled his formidable grandmother. For the first time in his adult life, the Duke of Montague found his legendary self-control beginning to slip, and the cause was a chestnut-haired woman with deep blue eyes who had somehow managed to charm his grandmother and capture his attention in the space of a single morning. The thought should have alarmed him. Instead, as he listened to the sound of animated conversation drifting down from his grandmother's suite, Alfredo found himself looking forward to his next encounter with the mysterious Miss Whitmore with an anticipation that had nothing to do with his grandmother's welfare and everything to do with his own increasingly complicated feelings. Growing attraction. Over the following weeks, Alfredo found himself developing what he told himself was a professional interest in Miss Whitmore's progress with his grandmother. He made a point of checking on them each morning and evening, ostensibly to ensure that his grandmother was receiving proper care, but increasingly to observe the remarkable transformation that was taking place. Under Miss Whitmore's gentle but efficient care, Eleanor had begun to flourish in ways that surprised everyone, including Dr. Harrison. Her appetite had improved, her sleep was more restful, and most remarkably, her spirits had lifted considerably. She looked forward to each day with an enthusiasm that had been absent for months, eager to continue whatever project she and Miss Whitmore were working on together. The library reorganization had become a major undertaking, with Miss Whitmore spending hours each day carefully cataloguing Eleanor's extensive collection while engaging her in discussions about each book's merits and significance. But it was more than just intellectual stimulation that was benefiting his grandmother. It was the genuine friendship that had developed between the two women. Alfredo often found them together in the library, heads bent over some volume or another, debating literary merits or historical interpretations with the kind of passionate engagement that had once characterized Eleanor's conversations with the leading intellectuals of her generation. Miss Whitmore treated his grandmother not as an invalid to be managed, but as a brilliant woman whose opinions and insights were valued and sought after. "Your Miss Whitmore is quite remarkable," Dr. Harrison commented during one of his regular visits. "I've never seen such improvement in a patient's overall well-being without any change in medical treatment. Whatever she's doing, it's working." "She's not my Miss Whitmore," Alfredo replied automatically, though the correction felt hollow even to his own ears. Dr. Harrison raised an eyebrow at the defensive tone. "Of course not, Your Grace. I simply meant that your choice of companion has proven to be inspired. The Dowager Duchess is thriving under her care." Alfredo nodded, though he was uncomfortably aware that his interest in Miss Whitmore's success went far beyond its impact on his grandmother's health. He found himself looking for excuses to spend time in the library, ostensibly to check on the reorganization project, but actually to listen to the conversations between the two women and to observe Miss Whitmore's animated discussions of literature and history. She was, he was discovering, remarkably well educated for someone of her modest background. Her knowledge ranged from classical literature to contemporary political theory, from art history to natural philosophy. She could discuss the finer points of Greek tragedy with the same enthusiasm she brought to debates about agricultural reform or the latest scientific discoveries. More intriguingly, she had opinions, well-reasoned, thoughtfully expressed opinions that she was not afraid to defend even when they differed from his grandmother's views. Eleanor, far from being offended by such independence of thought, was delighted to have found someone who could challenge her intellectually. "Miss Whitmore believes that women should be allowed to attend university," Eleanor announced one evening, when Alfredo joined them for tea in the library. "She makes quite a compelling argument for it." Alfredo looked at Miss Whitmore with surprise. Such progressive views were unusual even among the most liberal members of society. "Indeed. And what is your reasoning, Miss Whitmore?" She met his gaze steadily, showing no sign of intimidation despite the controversial nature of her position. "I believe that intelligence is not limited by gender, Your Grace. If women are capable of learning, and the evidence suggests they are, then they should have access to the same educational opportunities as men." "But surely you must acknowledge the practical difficulties," Alfredo said, genuinely curious about her response. "The social implications, the question of whether such education would be compatible with traditional feminine roles." "With respect, Your Grace, I think the question should be whether traditional feminine roles are compatible with human potential," Miss Whitmore replied. "If a woman has the capacity to contribute to medicine or law or natural philosophy, shouldn't society benefit from those contributions rather than waste them?" Eleanor clapped her hands in delight. "Exactly what I've been saying for 60 years. Alfredo, this girl understands what most of society refuses to acknowledge, that limiting women's education limits society's progress." Alfredo found himself impressed by Miss Whitmore's articulate defense of her position, even as he recognized the radical nature of her views. "You argue your point well, Miss Whitmore. Have you given thought to how such changes might be implemented?" "Gradually, Your Grace, and with careful attention to practical concerns. Perhaps beginning with allowing women to audit lectures, then progressing to formal admission as circumstances permit. Change of this magnitude cannot happen overnight, but it must begin somewhere." "And you would be willing to be among the first to take advantage of such opportunities?" Alfredo asked. Miss Whitmore's expression grew wistful. "I would have been, Your Grace, under different circumstances, but my path has led me elsewhere, and I've found fulfillment in caring for others. Perhaps future generations of women will have choices that were not available to me." There was no bitterness in her tone, only a quiet acceptance that somehow made her sacrifice seem even more poignant. Alfredo found himself wondering what Miss Whitmore might have accomplished if she had been born into different circumstances, with access to the education and opportunities she clearly deserved. "Your great-aunt would be proud of your accomplishments," he said quietly. "I hope so, Your Grace." She always said that the true measure of education was not what one learned, but what one did with that learning to benefit others. "A wise woman," Eleanor observed. "I should have liked to meet her." "She would have enjoyed knowing you, Your Grace," Miss Whitmore replied warmly. She had great respect for women who used their positions of influence to support worthy causes. As the conversation continued, Alfredo found himself studying Miss Whitmore with growing fascination. There were layers to her character that he was only beginning to discover: intellectual depth, moral conviction, and a strength of purpose that had enabled her to sacrifice her own ambitions for the welfare of someone she loved. But it was more than her character that drew his attention. He was becoming increasingly aware of her physical presence, the way candlelight caught the auburn highlights in her chestnut hair, the expressive quality of her deep blue eyes when she discussed something that passionate about, the graceful gestures of her hands as she illustrated a point. She was beautiful, he realized, though her beauty was of the quiet, understated variety that revealed itself gradually rather than demanding immediate attention. It was the kind of beauty that grew more compelling with acquaintance, rooted in character and intelligence, rather than mere physical perfection. The realization that he was attracted to his grandmother's companion was deeply unsettling. Alfredo had always maintained strict boundaries between his personal and professional relationships, and he had never allowed himself to become romantically involved with anyone in his employ. The power imbalance alone made such relationships inappropriate, not to mention the potential complications for his grandmother's care. Yet he could not deny the growing warmth he felt in Miss Whitmore's presence, or the way his pulse quickened when she smiled at something his grandmother said, or the disappointment he experienced when business obligations kept him from joining their evening conversations. "You seem distracted lately, Alfredo," Eleanor observed one morning when he had been staring out the window instead of listening to her account of the previous day's library progress. "Distracted? I don't know what you mean, grandmother." Eleanor's sharp eyes missed nothing, and her expression suggested she was not fooled by his denial. "You've been wool gathering for the past 10 minutes, while I've been telling you about Miss Whitmore's brilliant solution to cataloging the poetry collection." Either you've developed a sudden disinterest in efficiency, or your mind is occupied with other matters. Alfredo felt heat rise in his cheeks, a reaction that only seemed to confirm his grandmother's suspicions. I apologize, grandmother. I was thinking about some business concerns. Business concerns, Eleanor repeated skeptically. How odd. I could have sworn you were thinking about something or someone much more pleasant than business. Before Alfredo could formulate a response, Miss Whitmore entered the room carrying a tea tray, her appearance providing a welcome distraction from his grandmother's uncomfortably perceptive observations. Good morning, Your Grace, she said to Alfredo with her usual warm smile. I hope you don't mind my joining you. The Dowager Duchess and I were planning to review the catalogue cards we completed yesterday. Not at all, Alfredo replied, though he was acutely aware of the way his grandmother was watching his reaction to Miss Whitmore's presence. I'd be interested to see your progress. Miss Whitmore moved to the small table where she had arranged several neat stacks of index cards, each filled with her precise handwriting. As she began to explain the system she had developed, Alfredo found himself focusing more on the musical quality of her voice than on the actual content of her words. Each card contains not only the basic bibliographic information, she was saying, but also a brief note about the book's condition and any special handling requirements. This way, the Dowager Duchess can make informed decisions about which volumes might need professional restoration. Very thorough, Alfredo managed, forcing himself to focus on the cards rather than the way Miss Whitmore's eyes lit up when she discussed her work. Miss Whitmore has also suggested that we create a separate catalogue of books that might be of interest to visiting scholars, Eleanor added. She believes that sharing knowledge is as important as preserving it. An admirable philosophy, Alfredo said, looking at Miss Whitmore with genuine admiration. You seem to have thought of everything. I've had excellent guidance from the Dowager Duchess, Miss Whitmore replied modestly. Her knowledge of the collection's history and significance has been invaluable. Nonsense, Eleanor said firmly. The girl is being modest. She's brought fresh perspective and innovative thinking to a project that had been overwhelming me for years. As the morning progressed, Alfredo found himself drawn into the discussion of library organization with an enthusiasm that surprised him. He had always appreciated efficiency and good organization, but there was something about Miss Whitmore's passionate commitment to preserving and sharing knowledge that made the project seem like more than mere household management. Have you considered extending this system to the main library downstairs? He asked, surprising himself with the suggestion. Miss Whitmore's eyes widened with interest. The main library? I hadn't presumed. That is, I wouldn't want to overstep. You wouldn't be overstepping, Alfredo assured her. If this system works as well as it appears to, it might benefit the entire collection. The main library contains nearly 10,000 volumes, Eleanor said thoughtfully. It would be quite an undertaking. But think of the result, Miss Whitmore said, her excitement evident. A comprehensive catalogue that would make the entire collection accessible not just to the family, but to serious scholars who might benefit from access to such resources. Alfredo found himself caught up in her enthusiasm. You would be willing to take on such a project? I would be honored, Your Grace, if you think it would be worthwhile, though it would require considerable time and effort. Time and effort that would be well invested, Alfredo said firmly. Consider it authorized. The smile that lit Miss Whitmore's face at his approval was radiant, and Alfredo felt something shift in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with professional satisfaction and everything to do with the pleasure of making her happy. Thank you, Your Grace, she said softly. I won't disappoint you. I'm certain you won't, Alfredo replied, meaning it completely. As he left his grandmother's suite that morning, Alfredo was forced to acknowledge that his feelings for Miss Whitmore had moved far beyond professional appreciation. He was attracted to her intelligence, her passion for learning, her gentle strength, and yes, her quiet beauty that seemed to grow more compelling each day. The realization should have alarmed him. Instead, as he made his way to his study, Alfredo found himself wondering what it would be like to court Miss Jacqueline Whitmore properly, not as an employer to an employee, but as a man to a woman he was coming to care for deeply. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying, representing as it did a complete departure from the careful control that had governed his life for so many years. But as he settled at his desk and tried to focus on his correspondence, Alfredo could not shake the feeling that Miss Whitmore was worth any risk, any departure from his usual caution. For the first time in his adult life, the Duke of Montague was contemplating the possibility that there might be something more important than control, and that something was love. The turning point. The autumn days grew shorter and cooler, but inside Montague House there was a warmth and energy that had been absent for years. Miss Whitmore's presence had transformed not just Eleanor's daily routine, but the entire atmosphere of the household. Staff members who had grown accustomed to moving quietly through the corridors now found themselves smiling as they went about their duties, buoyed by the sound of laughter and animated conversation that frequently drifted from the library. Alfredo had authorized the expansion of the cataloging project to include the main library, a decision that had given Miss Whitmore access to nearly every corner of his ancestral home. He told himself that his frequent visits to check on her progress were motivated by professional interest, but he was increasingly aware that his true motivation was simply the pleasure of her company. She had a way of making even the most mundane aspects of library organization seem fascinating, explaining the historical significance of various volumes or sharing interesting discoveries she had made among the collection. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and Alfredo found himself looking forward to these conversations with an anticipation that had nothing to do with books and everything to do with the woman discussing them. "Your Grace," Miss Whitmore said one afternoon, as he found her working in the main library, surrounded by neat stacks of books and index cards, "I've made the most remarkable discovery." She was kneeling on the floor beside a low shelf, her simple grey dress spread around her in a way that somehow managed to be both practical and graceful. Her hair had come slightly loose from its pins during her work, and there was a smudge of dust on her cheek that she seemed unaware of. Alfredo found the sight utterly charming. "What have you discovered?" he asked, moving closer to see what had captured her attention. "A first edition of Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Woman," she said, her voice filled with reverence as she carefully lifted the volume, "and it appears to be signed by the author herself." Alfredo knelt beside her to examine the book, acutely aware of her proximity and the faint scent of lavender that seemed to cling to her hair. "That would be quite valuable," he said, though his attention was more focused on the way her eyes sparkled with excitement than on the book itself. "Valuable beyond measure," Miss Whitmore agreed. "This work was revolutionary when it was published. Wollstonecraft argued that women deserved the same educational opportunities as men, that they were capable of reason and intellectual achievement if given the chance to develop their minds. Ideas that you clearly share," Alfredo observed, remembering their earlier conversation about women's education. "I do," Miss Whitmore said firmly, "though I suspect such views make me rather radical by most people's standards." "Perhaps," Alfredo said, studying her animated features, "but I find myself increasingly convinced that radical ideas are often simply ideas whose time has come." Miss Whitmore looked at him with surprise. "You agree with Wollstonecraft's arguments?" "I'm beginning to think that any society that wastes half its intellectual potential is foolish in the extreme," Alfredo replied, "particularly when I've seen firsthand how much one brilliant woman can accomplish when given the opportunity." The compliment brought a flush to Miss Whitmore's cheeks, and she looked down at the book in her hands as if suddenly finding it difficult to meet his gaze. "You're very kind, Your Grace." "I'm very honest," Alfredo said, echoing the words he had spoken to another remarkable woman in an orange grove what seemed like a lifetime ago. "Kindness has nothing to do with it." The moment stretched between them, charged with an awareness that had nothing to do with books or cataloging systems. Alfredo found himself studying the curve of Miss Whitmore's cheek, the way her lashes cast shadows on her skin, the soft fullness of her lips. He was close enough to touch her, close enough to— "Your Grace," came Mrs. Pemberton's voice from the library doorway, causing both of them to spring apart as if they had been caught in some impropriety. "Yes, Mrs. Pemberton," Alfredo said, rising to his feet and hoping his voice sounded steadier than he felt. "Lord Pemberton has called to see you, Your Grace. He's waiting in your study." Alfredo felt a flash of irritation at the interruption, followed immediately by guilt for resenting a visit from one of his oldest friends. "Tell him I'll be with him directly." As Mrs. Pemberton departed, Alfredo turned back to Miss Whitmore, who was still kneeling beside the bookshelf but had composed herself with admirable efficiency. "I should attend to my visitor," he said reluctantly. "Of course, Your Grace," she replied, though he thought he detected a note of disappointment in her voice that matched his own. "I'll continue with the cataloguing." Alfredo made his way to his study, his mind still occupied with the moment that had just passed between them. There had been something in Miss Whitmore's expression, a softness in her eyes that suggested she might not be entirely immune to the attraction that was growing stronger each day. The thought both thrilled and troubled him. If Miss Whitmore was developing feelings for him, it complicated an already delicate situation. As her employer, he held all the power in their relationship, and any romantic involvement would be fraught with ethical concerns. Yet the possibility that she might care for him as he was coming to care for her was too compelling to dismiss. "Alfredo, my dear fellow," Lord Pemberton greeted him as he entered the study. "I hope you don't mind my calling without notice, but I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd see how you're getting on." "Always welcome, Charles," Alfredo replied, though he was still distracted by thoughts of Miss Whitmore. "What brings you to this part of town?" "Actually, I was hoping to speak with you about a rather delicate matter," Pemberton said, his expression growing serious. "It concerns your grandmother's companion, Miss Whitmore." Alfredo felt a chill of apprehension. "What about Miss Whitmore?" "Well, it's rather awkward, but I feel I must tell you what I've heard. There's been some talk in certain circles about your household, specifically about the young woman you've employed to care for the Dowager Duchess." "What sort of talk?" Alfredo asked, his voice carefully controlled despite the anger that was beginning to build. "Nothing specific, you understand, but there are those who question the wisdom of employing someone without proper references or connections. Some are suggesting that your generosity in hiring her might be motivated by considerations other than your grandmother's welfare." The implication was clear, and Alfredo felt his temper flare. "Are you suggesting that I hired Miss Whitmore for improper reasons?" "Good God, no," Pemberton said hastily, clearly alarmed by the dangerous edge in Alfredo's voice. "I would never suggest such a thing. I know you too well to believe you capable of anything improper. But you know how society gossips, especially when it concerns someone of your position and an unmarried woman of uncertain background." Alfredo forced himself to remain calm, though every instinct urged him to defend Miss Whitmore's honor with the full force of his authority. Miss Whitmore was recommended by Dr. Harrison based on her exceptional qualifications and character. "Her care of my grandmother has been exemplary in every respect." "I'm sure it has," Pemberton said soothingly, "and I'm certain Miss Whitmore is everything you believe her to be. But perception can be as damaging as reality in our circles, and I thought you should be aware of what's being whispered." "Who exactly is doing this whispering?" Alfredo asked, his tone suggesting that whoever was responsible would face consequences. "No one of any real importance," Pemberton assured him. "Lady Thornfield and her circle mostly. You know how she delights in finding fault with others' arrangements." Alfredo did indeed know Lady Thornfield, a bitter woman whose own scandals had been conveniently forgotten by society, but who took particular pleasure in manufacturing controversies about others. The fact that she was targeting Miss Whitmore filled him with protective fury. "Lady Thornfield is welcome to her opinions," Alfredo said coldly. "They are of no consequence to me or to my household arrangements." "Of course not," Pemberton agreed quickly. "I simply thought you should be prepared, in case the gossip spreads beyond her immediate circle. Perhaps if Miss Whitmore were to be seen in more conventional circumstances, chaperoned visits to appropriate social functions, that sort of thing, it might quiet the talk." The suggestion was well-meaning, but it revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of the situation. Miss Whitmore was not a member of society seeking to establish her reputation. She was a working woman whose livelihood depended on her employment. Dragging her into social situations where she would be scrutinized and judged seemed both cruel and pointless. "Miss Whitmore's position is that of a companion and nurse," Alfredo said firmly. "She has no need of social validation from people who have never met her and know nothing of her character." "Quite right," Pemberton said, though his expression suggested he thought Alfredo was being naive about the potential consequences of ignoring society's opinions. "I simply wanted you to be aware of the situation." After Pemberton departed, Alfredo remained in his study, wrestling with the implications of what he had learned. The gossip itself was merely an annoyance, but it highlighted the precarious nature of Miss Whitmore's position. As long as she remained in his employ, she would be vulnerable to exactly this sort of speculation and innuendo. The realization crystallized a decision that had been forming in his mind for weeks. If he truly cared for Miss Whitmore, and he was forced to acknowledge that he did, deeply and completely, then he needed to offer her something more than employment. He needed to offer her the protection of his name and position, the security that would come with being his wife rather than his employee. The thought of marriage, which had seemed impossible just months ago, now felt not only possible but inevitable. Miss Whitmore had become essential to his happiness in ways that had nothing to do with his grandmother's care and everything to do with her own remarkable qualities. Her intelligence challenged him, her compassion inspired him, and her presence had brought a warmth to his life that he had never realized was missing. But would she accept such an offer? The gulf between their social positions was vast, and she might well believe that any proposal from him was motivated by pity or mere physical attraction rather than genuine love and respect. He would need to approach the matter with delicacy, ensuring that she understood his feelings were sincere and that any decision she made would be freely chosen. That evening, Alfredo found himself pacing his study, rehearsing various approaches to a conversation that would determine the course of both their lives. He was still wrestling with the problem when Mrs. Pemberton appeared in his doorway with an expression of concern. "Your Grace, I'm sorry to disturb you, but there's been an incident with the Dowager Duchess." Alfredo's blood ran cold. "What sort of incident?" "She's had another episode, Your Grace. Miss Whitmore is with her now, and Dr. Harrison has been sent for, but—" Mrs. Pemberton's voice trailed off, her distress evident. Alfredo was already moving toward the door. "How bad is it?" "Quite serious, I'm afraid, Your Grace. Miss Whitmore managed the immediate crisis admirably, but the Dowager Duchess is very weak." Alfredo took the stairs 2 at a time, his heart pounding with fear and dread. He found his grandmother's suite filled with quiet activity, Miss Whitmore moving efficiently between the bedside and a small table where medications were arranged, her face pale but composed as she monitored Eleanor's breathing and pulse. "How is she?" Alfredo asked quietly, not wanting to disturb his grandmother if she was sleeping. "Stable for now," Miss Whitmore replied, her voice steady, despite the obvious strain she was under. "Her heart rhythm became very irregular about an hour ago, and she had difficulty breathing. I was able to administer the medication Dr. Harrison prescribed for such episodes, and she's resting more comfortably now." Alfredo moved to his grandmother's bedside, noting her pallor and the fragile quality of her breathing. She looked smaller somehow, more vulnerable than he had ever seen her. "You handled this well," he said to Miss Whitmore, meaning it completely. "Thank you." "It's what I'm here for, Your Grace," she replied, though he could see the emotional toll the crisis had taken on her. She was frightened, which made it worse. "I think she understands that her time is growing short." The simple statement hit Alfredo like a physical blow. He had known intellectually that his grandmother was dying, but seeing her so fragile and vulnerable made the reality impossible to ignore. "Dr. Harrison should be here soon," Miss Whitmore continued, "but I think it might be wise to prepare for the possibility that there will be more episodes like this one." Alfredo nodded, unable to trust his voice. The thought of losing his grandmother was devastating enough, but the realization that he might also lose Miss Whitmore, that her employment would end when Eleanor's life did, was almost unbearable. "Alfredo," came a weak voice from the bed. "I'm here, grandmother," he said, taking her frail hand in his. Eleanor's eyes opened, focusing on his face with effort. "Good. I wanted to tell you, Miss Whitmore saved my life tonight. Without her quick thinking and steady hands, I would not have survived that episode." "I know, grandmother. Rest now." "No, listen to me," Eleanor said with a flash of her old authority. "This girl is extraordinary, Alfredo. Don't let her slip away when I'm gone. Promise me." The directness of the request caught Alfredo off guard, but before he could respond, Dr. Harrison arrived, bringing with him the bustle of medical attention that pushed personal concerns into the background. As the physician examined Eleanor and consulted with Miss Whitmore about the evening's events, Alfredo found himself watching the woman who had become so central to his life. She answered Dr. Harrison's questions with precision and clarity, demonstrating a medical knowledge that impressed even the experienced physician. "Excellent work, Miss Whitmore," Dr. Harrison said finally. "Your quick response almost certainly prevented a much more serious outcome. The Dowager Duchess is fortunate to have someone so capable caring for her." "Thank you, Doctor," Miss Whitmore replied, though Alfredo could see the exhaustion in her face. "Will there be anything else I should watch for tonight?" "I think the immediate danger has passed, but someone should stay with her." "Are you prepared to do that?" "Of course," Miss Whitmore said without hesitation. "I'll remain here." After Dr. Harrison departed, Alfredo lingered in his grandmother's sitting room while Miss Whitmore settled herself in a chair beside the bed, prepared for a long night of vigilance. The sight of her quiet dedication, her willingness to sacrifice her own comfort for his grandmother's welfare, only strengthened his resolve. "Miss Whitmore," he said quietly, "you should try to rest. I can stay with her for a while." "Thank you, Your Grace, but I'm not tired," she replied, though the shadows under her eyes suggested otherwise. "Besides, I know her medications and what to watch for. It's better if I stay." "You can't care for her properly if you exhaust yourself," Alfredo pointed out gently. Miss Whitmore looked at him with a small smile. "Your concern is appreciated, Your Grace, but I've sat through many long nights, I know my limits. The quiet strength in her voice, the calm acceptance of duty and sacrifice, crystallized everything Alfredo had been feeling into a moment of perfect clarity. This woman, intelligent, compassionate, utterly selfless in her devotion to those she cared for, was exactly who he wanted to spend his life with. Jacqueline, he said softly, using her given name for the first time. She looked up at him in surprise, her deep blue eyes wide in the lamplight. When this crisis has passed, he continued, there's something important I need to discuss with you. Something that has nothing to do with my grandmother's care and everything to do with my own feelings. Understanding dawned in her expression, followed quickly by something that might have been hope. Your Grace, Not now, Alfredo said gently. Now your attention belongs to my grandmother, as it should. But soon, I hope you'll allow me to tell you how much you've come to mean to me. Miss Whitmore's cheeks flushed pink, but she met his gaze steadily. I would be honored to listen to whatever you wish to tell me, Your Grace. The promise in her words, the warmth in her eyes, gave Alfredo hope that his feelings might not be entirely one-sided. As he finally retired to his own chambers, leaving Miss Whitmore to her vigil, he carried with him the certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, he wanted to face them with Jacqueline Whitmore at his side, not as his employee, but as his wife, his partner, and the woman he loved with all his heart. The Duke of Montague, who had spent his entire adult life maintaining perfect control over his emotions and circumstances, was finally ready to surrender that control to love, and for the first time in years, the prospect of the unknown future filled him not with anxiety, but with anticipation for the happiness that awaited him if he was brave enough to claim it. Eleanor survived the night, though Dr. Harrison's morning examination confirmed what they all feared. Her condition was deteriorating more rapidly than expected. The episodes would likely become more frequent and severe, and her time was measured in weeks rather than months. I want to speak with both of you, Eleanor announced the following evening, her voice weak but determined. She was propped up in her bed, looking frail but alert, with Miss Whitmore seated beside her and Alfredo standing nearby. You should rest, grandmother, Alfredo said gently. I'll have plenty of time to rest soon enough, Eleanor replied, with a flash of her old spirit. Right now, I have things to say, and you're going to listen. Miss Whitmore squeezed the elderly woman's hand encouragingly. We're listening, Your Grace. Good. Eleanor's sharp eyes moved between them, missing nothing. I may be dying, but I'm not blind. I've watched the two of you dance around each other for weeks, and frankly, it's becoming tedious. Alfredo felt heat rise in his cheeks. Grandmother, I don't think... Alfredo, you're in love with this remarkable woman, and unless I'm very much mistaken, she returns your feelings. The question is what you intend to do about it. Miss Whitmore's face had turned crimson, but she didn't deny Eleanor's observation. Your Grace, perhaps this isn't the appropriate time. When would be the appropriate time? Eleanor interrupted. After I'm dead and you've disappeared back into whatever modest life you came from? Nonsense. Life is short, my dear children, and love is precious. Don't waste either one on false propriety. Alfredo looked at Miss Whitmore, seeing his own emotions reflected in her deep blue eyes. Perhaps my grandmother is right, he said quietly. Perhaps it's time we spoke honestly about what's been growing between us. I don't want to presume, Miss Whitmore began. You're not presuming anything, Alfredo said firmly, moving to sit in the chair on the other side of Eleanor's bed. Jacqueline, these past weeks have shown me something I never expected to find. You've brought light and warmth not just to my grandmother's life, but to mine as well. Alfredo, she whispered, his name a soft breath on her lips. I love you, he said simply, the words feeling both momentous and perfectly natural. I love your intelligence, your compassion, your strength, and your gentle spirit. I love the way you make my grandmother laugh, the way you've transformed this house into a home, and the way you've made me believe in the possibility of happiness I never knew I was missing. Tears gathered in Jacqueline's eyes, but her smile was radiant. I love you too, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. I never dared to hope that someone like you could care for someone like me. Someone like you? Alfredo repeated, reaching across his grandmother's bed to take her hand. You mean someone intelligent, kind, beautiful, and utterly remarkable? Jacqueline, you're everything I never knew I wanted in a wife. Wife, she breathed, her eyes widening. If you'll have me, Alfredo said, his heart pounding. I know the circumstances are unusual, and I know there will be challenges, but I can't imagine my life without you in it. Marry me, Jacqueline. Not because you need security or I need a companion for my grandmother, but because we love each other and want to build a life together." "Oh, Alfredo," Jacqueline said, tears flowing freely now. Yes, of course I'll marry you." "Finally," Eleanor declared with satisfaction. "I was beginning to think I'd have to lock you both in the library until you came to your senses." Alfredo rose and moved around the bed to take Jacqueline in his arms, kissing her with all the passion and tenderness he had been holding back for weeks. She melted against him, her arms circling his neck as she returned his kiss with equal fervor. "Ahem," Eleanor said pointedly. "While I'm delighted by this development, perhaps you could save the more passionate demonstrations for after you're properly married." They broke apart, both laughing and crying at the same time, their faces glowing with happiness and love. "When?" Jacqueline asked. "When shall we marry?" "As soon as possible," Alfredo said firmly. "I've waited 34 years to find you, and I don't want to wait any longer than necessary to make you my wife." "What about the gossip Lord Pemberton mentioned?" Jacqueline asked, her practical nature asserting itself even in the midst of her joy. "Let them gossip," Alfredo said dismissively. "Once you're the Duchess of Montague, they'll sing a very different tune, and anyone who doesn't will find themselves unwelcome in my presence." "Our presence," Jacqueline corrected with a smile. "We're partners now, remember?" "Partners," Alfredo agreed, kissing her hand. "In everything." The wedding and beyond the wedding took place 3 weeks later in the private chapel at Montague House, with Eleanor insisting on being present despite her weakening condition. It was a small ceremony, attended only by close friends and family, but it was perfect in its simplicity and sincerity. Jacqueline wore a gown of ivory silk that Alfredo had commissioned from London's finest modiste, and she had never looked more beautiful. As she walked down the aisle toward him, Alfredo felt his heart swell with love and gratitude for the remarkable woman who was about to become his wife. The ceremony was conducted by the family chaplain, with Eleanor beaming from her wheelchair and Dr. Harrison serving as one of the witnesses. When Alfredo and Jacqueline exchanged vows, promising to love, honor, and cherish each other for the rest of their lives, there wasn't a dry eye in the chapel. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the chaplain declared. "You may kiss your bride." Alfredo needed no further encouragement, taking Jacqueline in his arms and kissing her with all the love and joy in his heart. The small congregation erupted in applause, and Eleanor's voice could be heard above the rest, declaring it about time. The wedding breakfast was held in the main dining room, with Mrs. Pemberton having outdone herself in preparing a feast worthy of the occasion. Eleanor, despite her frailty, insisted on making a toast. "To my grandson and his beautiful bride," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "May your love grow stronger with each passing year, and may you always remember that the greatest wealth is not in what you possess, but in what you share with each other." As the guests raised their glasses, Alfredo looked at his new wife and saw his own happiness reflected in her radiant face. They had found something precious and rare, a love based on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine affection. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. 1 year later, Eleanor passed away peacefully in her sleep 6 weeks after the wedding, with Jacqueline holding her hand and Alfredo at her side. Her final words were of gratitude for the happiness she had witnessed and her confidence that her grandson had found his perfect match. Now, 1 year later, Alfredo stood in the library where he had first begun to fall in love with his wife, watching as she worked on the final stages of the cataloguing project that had brought them together. But she was not alone. In her arms was their 3-month-old daughter, little Eleanor, named for the remarkable woman who had brought them together. "She's going to be as brilliant as her mother," Alfredo said, approaching to kiss both his wife and daughter. "And as stubborn as her father," Jacqueline replied with a laugh, looking up at him with eyes that sparkled with love and contentment. "A formidable combination," Alfredo agreed, settling beside them on the comfortable sofa that had replaced the formal chairs in the library. "Are you happy?" Jacqueline asked, a question she had posed regularly during their first year of marriage, as if she still couldn't quite believe in their good fortune. "Completely," Alfredo replied, meaning it with every fiber of his being. "You've given me everything I never knew I wanted. Love, laughter, purpose, and now this beautiful daughter. How could I be anything but happy?" "I love you," Jacqueline said softly, the words as meaningful now as they had been the first time she spoke them. "And I love you," Alfredo replied, kissing her tenderly. "My brilliant, beautiful, remarkable wife." As they sat together in the library, surrounded by the books that had first revealed Jacqueline's extraordinary mind, with their daughter sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms, Alfredo reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment of perfect contentment. He had begun as a man who believed that control was everything, that emotions were weaknesses to be managed and contained. But Jacqueline had taught him that the greatest strength came not from controlling life, but from embracing it fully, with all its risks, uncertainties, and magnificent possibilities. Their love story had proven that sometimes the most unexpected arrangements could lead to the most extraordinary happiness, and that true partnership was built not on social conventions or practical considerations, but on mutual respect, shared dreams, and the courage to trust another person with your heart. The story of Duke Alfredo and Jacqueline Whitmore proves that true love knows no social barriers when built on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine admiration. They discovered that the greatest wealth lies not in what we possess, but in what we share with those we love. Their union demonstrates that sometimes the best decisions come from the heart, and when we find our soulmate, it's worth risking everything for the happiness that only true love can provide. May their story inspire everyone to believe that love can flourish in the most unexpected places, and that true nobility lies not in the title we carry, but in the kindness we show and the love we offer to the world. Subscribe for more enchanting historical romances that will sweep you off your feet. From passionate dukes to mysterious ladies, from forbidden love to happily ever after, discover stories that prove true love conquers all. Hit that subscribe button and join our community of romance lovers. Don't miss out on your next favorite love story.